And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaskan marine weather outlook to take you through the rest of this weekend and into Monday of next week. And looking at the sea ice, we are now at that minimal extent of sea ice in the Arctic. Pretty much happens around mid-September before the new season ice begins to develop late in the month or into early October. But at this point, we're almost to minimum, about a week or so away. And looking at the surface weather map starting late tonight, early on Sunday morning, strongest low pressure is southeast of the Alaska Peninsula, south of Kodiak Island. Not much of one at 991 millibars, but it still does have some gustier winds around it. And there's also another low here that has a little tighter gradient that could produce near gale force winds, certainly small craft type conditions along the outer coast of the Panhandle, especially up here in the northern Gulf as we go through the day on Sunday. Otherwise, the rest of these low pressures are rather weak, scattered about the interior and back toward the west into the Bering. Overall, we have in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere a cool, large circulation of low pressure over the Bering western portion of the state. And with this counterclockwise circulation, we're just seeing these systems just kind of meandering about and not a lot of push to them. The low that's coming up south and southeast of Kodiak Island on Sunday will gradually weaken as it lifts up into the lower Gulf. But anywhere within this area, it's kind of a moist, cool, unstable environment. There could be some scattered light showers scattered about areas of the mainland, along coastal areas. So an early fall pattern that will continue into the week ahead. And by Monday afternoon, pretty much across much of the mainland, just general weak areas of low pressure, where we have some lower ceilings combined with some areas of light showers up into the higher elevations of the mountains. There certainly could be some snow showers. And looking at the marine forecast Sunday, gustier winds within the middle channels here of the inner channels around Stevens Passage. 25 knots southeast winds, gust of 40 knots possible. Dixon entrance, southeast winds 15 knots, 2 3-foot waves around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, and then up there toward Lynn Canal. Southeast winds 10 knots, waves 2 feet. For the outer coast, southeast winds south of Sitka, 25 knots, gust as high as 40 knots off of Craig. Generally, east winds around 30 to as high as 35 knots here toward Cape Suckling, with waves running 10 to 13 feet. For Monday, winds do come down a bit. Southeast winds 25 knots at Ketchikan and Metlakatla, with waves running around 8 feet. 3 feet waves within Stevens Passage. Southeast winds 10 knots up through Lynn Canal, waves there a couple of feet. Outer coast southeast winds around 25 knots with 10-foot waves, Sitka southward off of Craig, and then easterly winds 25 to 30 knots west of Gustavus and outside of Yakutat Bay, with waves running 9 to 12 feet. Along the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds on Sunday will be off the Kenai coast and just northeast of Kodiak City. Look for northeast to east winds 25 to 30 knots into the entrance there of Cook Inlet. As we go upward, northeast winds 10 knots within Prince William Sound, a couple of foot waves, and then upper Cook Inlet, 15-knot northeasterly winds with waves 2 to 3 feet. For Monday, they'll come down further. North winds 10 knots, 2-foot waves, Prince William Sound. Northwest winds 15 knots, 5-6-foot waves off the Kenai coast. And then variable winds in upper Cook Inlet at 10 knots, waves a couple of feet there. And then down toward the entrance of Cook Inlet, west winds 20 knots with waves running around 5 feet. On Sunday, Kodiak Island, we'll see east-northeast winds to 35 knots because there's a low-pressure circulation just southeast of Kodiak Island here entering the southwestern Gulf. Winds fall off, northerly winds 20 knots on the North Pacific side, 15-knot northerly winds on the Bering side, waves 3 to 5 feet on the Bering side, as high as 5 to 6 feet there off of Sandpoint and False Pass. And then for Monday, look for westerly winds 15 to 20 knots across Kodiak Island. Variable winds east of Chiknik, and generally winds turn back around to the southwest and west 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 5-foot waves here along the North Pacific side and 3 to as high as 6 feet there north of Cold Bay. Along the Aleutian chain initially Sunday, look for northeast winds in the far eastern Aleutians, 15 knots the vicinity of Unalaska, switching around to the west-northwest around 15 to 20 knots there westward. Waves generally running 5-6 feet on the North Pacific side, 4 to 6 feet on the Bering side. And for Monday, winds will generally be out of the west across the Aleutian chain, running right around 20 knots with 5 to 6 foot waves on the North Pacific side and 4 to 6 feet on the Bering side. For the southwest coast, north winds out of Bristol Bay at 15 knots, 3-foot waves. Northwest winds within Kuskokwim Bay at 10 knots, waves 2-3 feet. Variable winds 15 knots around St. Paul, St. George, waves 5 to 6 feet there. Winds turn onshore westerly at 10 knots along the lower Yukon Delta up into Norton Sound with waves there of 2 to 3 feet. Weak low circulation in the vicinity of St. Matthew on Monday will cause winds to be westerly to 25 knots at St. Paul and St. George with 8-foot waves. Southwest winds 15 knots into Bristol Bay with 2-foot waves, and southeast winds 15 knots within Kuskokwim Bay with 2-foot waves. And then as we get up north of Hooper Bay, winds are south-southwest around 10 knots from the lower Yukon Delta on up into Norton Sound. For areas south of the Bering Strait, west winds 10 to 15 knots, especially into the west side of Seward Peninsula and north side of St. Lawrence Island, waves 3 to 4 feet. Winds turn southeast 10 to 15 knots across the lower Chukchi Sea with 3-foot waves, and then winds pick up 20 to 25 knots, especially from Utqiagvik through Kaktovik with waves of 6 to 7 feet. And on Monday, those winds along the Arctic coast will come down a bit to around 15 knots with waves generally running 3 to 4 feet. Through the lower Chukchi Sea, winds will turn northeast and then more east-southeasterly at 10 knots with waves generally 2 feet. And then passing south of the Bering Strait, winds will generally have a south-southwest component to around 10 knots with waves generally running 2 feet in those areas.